The airport was buzzing with its usual chaos, voices echoing through the terminal, the hum of rolling suitcases, the crackling announcements from the intercom. Tanya Washington stood in line at the gate, dressed in a sleek navy pantsuit, her long braids pulled back neatly. She was calm, poised, and radiated confidence. In her hand, she clutched her boarding pass, a first-class ticket to New York City. Her flight was due to leave in 30 minutes, and she was ready to board. But as she approached the gate agent, she noticed something unusual. The way the woman behind the counter gave her a once-over, her lips pressed into a thin line. Tanya ignored it at first. After all, this was just another business trip. She had flown countless times before, presenting at conferences and attending board meetings for her role as CEO of one of the most respected tech companies in the country. But this time, something was different. The gate agent glanced at her boarding pass and then at Tanya. Her brow furrowed, and a tight, forced smile stretched across her face. "Ma'am," the agent said, her voice clipped, "I need you to step aside for additional verification." Tanya's heart sank, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Verification? What's the problem?" The agent's eyes flickered over her as if sizing her up. "Your ticket and ID? Something doesn't match. Please step aside while we investigate." A few people in the line behind Tanya shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves. She could feel their stares burning into her back, the weight of judgment she had grown too familiar with over the years. Tanya was used to moments like this, subtle acts of racial profiling wrapped up in an air of standard procedure. But that didn't make it any easier. "I can assure you everything is in order," Tanya said, her voice firm but composed. "This is my ticket, and my ID is valid." The agent didn't budge. "Step aside, ma'am." Tanya moved to the side as instructed, trying to ignore the murmurs and curious glances from the growing crowd. A second agent approached, this one a man with an air of authority. He, too, gave her the once-over, his demeanor skeptical. Tanya handed over her ID and boarding pass once again, watching as they whispered to each other while inspecting her documents. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but the occasional side glance they gave her was enough to confirm her suspicions. Her pulse quickened. She wanted to speak up, to demand they treat her with the same respect they afforded the white passengers who had already boarded without issue. But she knew how this game worked. Any sign of anger, any sharpness in her tone, and they would label her as difficult or hostile. So she waited, her chin held high, refusing to let them see her frustration. Minutes passed, and her patience began to wear thin. "What exactly is the problem?" Tanya asked, her tone cutting through their hushed conversation. The male agent turned to her, his expression guarded. "We need to verify that this ticket belongs to you. There have been issues with fraud." Tanya raised an eyebrow. "Fraud? Are you saying you suspect me of using a fraudulent ticket?" The agent hesitated. "We're just doing our due diligence, ma'am." Her jaw tightened. "I see. And is this due diligence being applied to every passenger? Or just me?" The man's face flushed slightly, but he didn't respond. Tanya's mind raced as she considered her options. She could call her assistant to confirm her travel arrangements, but why should she have to prove herself when she had done nothing wrong? The only red flag here was the color of her skin. As the agents continued their so-called investigation, a voice suddenly cut through the tension. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" Tanya turned to see a well-dressed black man approaching. His tailored suit and polished demeanor matched hers, but his face was one of quiet authority. She recognized him immediately. Jonathan Pierce, the CEO of a major airline. Tanya had met him once at a business conference where they had spoken about the challenges of navigating corporate America as black leaders. The gate agents, however, clearly didn't recognize him. The male agent straightened his posture, his tone overly formal. "This passenger is under additional verification. It's standard procedure." Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Interesting, because I just walked past the gate and I didn't see anyone else being pulled aside for verification." His tone was cool, measured, but it carried a weight that made the agents shift uncomfortably. "This is a routine check," the female agent said quickly, her smile faltering. Jonathan didn't break his gaze. "Routine, you say? Because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like racial profiling." The color drained from the agents' faces. Tanya almost smiled at how quickly their attitudes shifted. Suddenly, they were tripping over themselves to apologize. "Of course, we meant no disrespect," the male agent stammered, handing Tanya's documents back. "Everything appears to be in order." Tanya accepted her boarding pass and ID with a polite but pointed smile. "Thank you. I could have told you that 20 minutes ago." Jonathan gave her a subtle nod, his expression a mixture of respect and solidarity. "Let's go," he said, gesturing toward the gate. As they walked toward the plane, the whispers of the crowd grew louder, but Tanya ignored them. She wasn't going to let the stares ruin her day. Once they were seated in first class, Tanya turned to Jonathan. "Thank you for stepping in. I appreciate it." He shook his head. "You shouldn't have needed my help. It shouldn't have happened in the first place." She sighed, her hands resting on her lap. "You'd think after everything we've accomplished, after all the barriers we've broken, we wouldn't have to deal with this anymore." Jonathan smiled ruefully. "You'd think. But every time something like this happens, it reminds us why we keep pushing, why we keep succeeding. Because the more they see us in these spaces, the harder it is for them to deny we belong here." Tanya nodded, his words settling over her like a blanket of reassurance. "You're right. They don't get to define us." As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Tanya felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, the experience had been humiliating and frustrating, but she wouldn't let it diminish her. If anything, it only fueled her determination to keep rising, to keep proving that she, and others like her, belonged wherever they chose to be. And as the plane lifted into the sky, Tanya looked out the window, a quiet smile on her face. She was flying toward her future, unstoppable, unshaken, and unapologetically herself.